Record. Okay, so let's jump in to chapter 7. Before we begin, Kevin, the last time you were here, we had a question that we didn't wrap up, which was we were talking about some translation history and why were they translating from the Greek rather than the Hebrew? And the answer was obvious. I don't know why I didn't think of it in the moment, but typically, yes. So we talked about what's called the Masoretic text, which the Masoretes were a community who went in and pointed the Hebrew text. So they added in vowels and punctuation, which wasn't there in the original text. So the original text, you're reading it, you have no idea where a word ends unless you are doing that mental work. So the translation that is used to translate in other languages, the Masoretic text, that made some decisions about punctuation and vowels. And as a result of that, that's why that one word could be pointed two different ways. And so it was just in that one instance that the New Revised Standard Version updated edition decided that what the Masoretes chose in terms of the vowels, they didn't feel was the right choice. And so that's when they went to the Greek text instead, because the Greeks who were translating it from the non-pointed text had chosen something different.
But the non-pointed text does not extant, like we can't go back to that.
So we do have copies of that, but then you're just making that decision anyway. So it's typically translated from the Masoretic text, and so they just chose what the Greek translation had chosen in that one instance. But by and large, we are translating from the Hebrew for the Old Testament.
I recently read that something called the Codex Sassoon, which is a very, very old manuscript, has recently come out to public life for the first time in decades.
Oh, phenomenal.
It's going to be on public display at Sotheby's in LA sometime this summer.
Wow, that's fascinating. So if you're into manuscripts, that's why it's fun to go to Huntington to see some of those manuscripts. But if you're into manuscripts, that would be fascinating. Wow, thanks, Chris. Okay, so we are in chapter 7, and we saw something very interesting that some of the prophets do, in that they use the names of their children as a teaching lesson. And so Isaiah brings forward his son, and his son's name is Shear-Jashub, which translates into a remnant shall remain. And so as his bring your child to work day, his son comes with him as he's doing this prophecy, and his name is meant to say, even though I am telling you about the destruction that is impending, a remnant will remain. That's one of the main themes of the book of Isaiah, and he names his son that. And so we're going to see this 2 more times today, the naming of a child, and one of the passages that has been used a lot during the Advent season to talk about Christ. Yeah, Deanie, you have a question? Oh, you're just getting your glasses. So let's go ahead and continue on chapter 7. This is one of the most famous passages of Isaiah. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." Then Isaiah said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals, that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose 2 kings you are in dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on your ancestral house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. All right, so we've potentially heard this verse before. A young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. We read this during Advent season. Later, Christians will interpret this verse as pointing to the Messiah, to Jesus. And so we've talked in sermons before about the translation history of this particular verse, where it says, look, the young woman is with child. And so in the original Hebrew, the word is Alma, which exclusively means young woman. It does not mean virgin. But later, when the Hebrew text was being translated into Greek, They've read Alma, they translated it into Parthenos, and Parthenos can mean either young woman or it can mean virgin. And so the translation history, that's how we got the concept of a virgin shall give birth. But the original Hebrew has no word that implies virgin at all. It simply means young woman. So I'm going to get back to this verse in just a moment here. But Isaiah is speaking to Ahaz, and Ahaz is known as one of the evil kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. Notice something interesting about how Ahaz is named. Do you pick up on this at all? Like, kind of look through the passage. Is there a modifier to his name that's missing? King. Yeah. The judgment is such that Isaiah refuses to refer to him as King Ahaz. It would be as if we didn't give an honorific to like the president. We just said Bush instead of President Bush. If we were not happy with how that person was performing. Well, this is not King Ahaz, it's just Ahaz. And there's this really interesting interaction where Isaiah tells Ahaz to ask for a sign, and Ahaz responds in a way that seems fairly righteous, because there is a verse in scripture that says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. That we're not supposed to say, if you do this, then I'll do this, and I'll believe if only you do this. But Isaiah invites it, and he says, oh no, I'm not going to put God to the test. But Isaiah is upset at that, because there's this invitation from God, and yet he's potentially feigning this false righteousness. But really, he doesn't want to hear what God has to say, because if he does ask for a sign and sees the sign, then what Isaiah is telling him is true. That's kind of what's used in the time. Again, we really need to complicate the concept of what a prophet is. In our popular culture, we think of a prophet as predicting the future, but I've said a lot that a prophet is really about speaking truth to power. It's not predicting the future. But that's how it did operate at the time, in the sense that, how did you determine whether someone was a true prophet or not? Because a lot of people came forward claiming to speak for God. Well, someone was a true prophet if what they said came to pass. And so that comes up in one of the Old Testament books where Jeremiah is warring with this other prophet. And Jeremiah says, well, what you said doesn't happen. And what I say is that actually you're going to die soon. And then the guy dies. And like, oh, okay, Jeremiah is actually a true prophet. So that's what Ahaz is afraid of. If he puts God to the test and the sign comes to pass, then he's got to believe what Isaiah is saying. And what Isaiah is saying is that his kingship is going to come to an end. There's a lot here. This is a really great passage. So going to verse 11, let it be as deep as Sheol. Have you heard that word before, Sheol? So even in modern Judaism, there's not really a concept of an afterlife. The idea is just that we return to dust, and more of the concept of annihilation. There's just nothingness after death. And so Sheol is used in the Old Testament scriptures as kind of that place of nothingness. To descend to the depths of Sheol, it's not like a hell type situation. It's more just a place of nothingness. So that's Sheol, is just this void. So that's what Sheol means. So it's really not our modern concept of hell and heaven, as deep as hell or as high as heaven, but more just this place of nothingness. All right, so Isaiah says, look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. We get ourselves into trouble as Christian interpreters of the Bible. I'm not saying we can't do this. We can look to Old Testament scriptures and say, this is speaking to the context of Christ. That's an acceptable interpretive move. But we can't do that exclusively, because it's not as if Isaiah is saying this phrase and they have no idea what he's talking about because Jesus hasn't come yet. It has meaning to the people who are hearing it at that time as well. And so we're trying to figure out, as interpreters of this verse, what exactly is Isaiah talking about? Well, we're going to see in just a little bit a third instance of Isaiah naming his son with a prophetic message, and we just saw it a few verses earlier. So one theory is that this is a reference to Isaiah's own son, that he's going to have a son potentially with a prophetess or someone involved in cultic worship, and that's going to be spoken about in just a little bit. So that would be the young woman who's involved in bearing the son. A popular theory is that this is a reference to the royal household itself, that within the royal household, a son is going to be born, and that son will be called Emmanuel. Another theory related to that is that son, Emmanuel, is Hezekiah, who's going to become king after Ahaz and will be a righteous king who will help the Israelites come back to God to stave off the Assyrian attack and have this time of renewed religious devotion within Israel. And so that's who Emmanuel is. There's problems with timelines. If you were to sit down and write out a timeline using every reference in the history of the Bible, you would see there's a lot of errors. Like the timelines here are not 100% accurate. So when it says this person died in this year and this person was born in this year and started their rule this year, if you start mapping it out, you're like, wait a minute, this person died like 6 years before the next king was born. That doesn't make sense. So there's some issues with timeline, but nevertheless, the idea is that potentially it's King Hezekiah is the son who's going to be born and called Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. So I'm not that familiar with eating curds myself, but the idea is that there's this bountifulness in the land at this time, and yet for someone to be eating curds would mean some sort of destruction has happened. Why would you not eat the good fat part? Why would you be scraping the curds off the top and only eating the curds? And so something's going to happen in the land by the time this child has moral agency. And so that's what that is a reference to, that something is going to happen such that this child will be eating curds before it's old enough to be able to know the difference between good and evil. And so it's telling Ahaz that this time is coming, but it's not a destruction of Judah. Instead, it's a destruction of what he's fearing. Yeah.
I just have a question about curds. I always thought of curds.
Yeah.
So you're saying scraping with that, like, what is, when I made cottage cheese before I was in science, we had to make it like, kind of, it's not technical, but what are you talking about?
Yeah, so just my understanding of it is that you would not be eating curds if you had other options.
Really?
That there's better parts to the process at this time culturally than eating the curds.
Okay.
But that's what's going to be available to him. But in our culture, we love, I don't know, who loves cottage cheese? Kevin loves cottage cheese. So he would love to eat curds and honey. But it's not, I guess, the choice food at the time. So if you're hearing this at the time, you would think, oh, why is he eating curds and honey when we have bountifulness in the land?
So the king's son is eating curds.
Yeah.
So that says something.
Yeah.
Maybe that's.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he should be in this wealthy,
Right.
he should not have to devolve to that point. Exactly. All right, let me see if there's anything else I want to touch on here. Feel free to put stuff in the chat if you're online. Okay, so for before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted. So historically, remember what we're dealing with here is that the northern kingdom is in cahoots with the Syrian Ephraimite. There's a Syro-Ephraimite war. So Aram, Damascus, and the northern kingdom are trying to defeat Judah in addition to Assyria attacking. So what he's saying is like, look, you are going to have judgment come upon you personally as Ahaz. You're no longer King Ahaz, you're just Ahaz, and you're going to fall from the throne. And this young child is going to be called Emmanuel, God is with us. But Syro-Ephraimite war here, they're not going to defeat you. You're going to be fine as a nation, but not as a person. So that's the judgment Isaiah is issuing. Okay, a lot there, a lot of richness. Any other questions or thoughts that came up with this verse? Okay. Well, then let's continue. Yeah.
Just real quick. When Ahaz says, I will not put the Lord to the test, like, is that like sort of a quotation? Is that the text? I know Jesus saying it, right? When he says it the same word is written, shall not put the Lord to the test. I'm not sure where it is in the scriptures, but like when Ahaz is saying that, is he being devout, like by quoting scripture and saying that I'm not going to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not off the top of my head sure exactly where that would be, but I think so. I think he's trying to appear extremely devout and say, like, here, look, I know. The question was for those online: is he quoting here when he says, "I will not put the Lord to the test"? Is he trying to be devout? Yeah, that's what's happening here. He's trying to, according to Isaiah's perspective, trying to feign false devotion.
It's interesting that when Jesus says it, because there could be an echo of Ahaz having said it.
Oh, interesting.
Like using scripture for his own purposes.
Yeah.
Sort of
Yeah. Yeah. So Kevin says, then it makes it interesting that Jesus is kind of echoing the same concept as Ahaz here, and very much gets to the question of, what's the spirit of the law? What's the motivation? For what purpose are you quoting scripture? Something that we keep in mind anytime we quote scripture. What's our motivation for quoting scripture? Okay, 18. On that day, the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the sources of the streams of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they will come and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rocks and on all the thorn bushes and in all the watering holes. On that day, the Lord will shave with a razor hired beyond the river with the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet, and it will take off the beard as well. On that day, one will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep and will eat curds because of the abundance of milk that they give. For everyone left in the land shall eat curds and honey. Okay. So whistling for a fly and for a bee. I mean, we can think of the idea of a fly being annoying, right? And so this fly is being called out of Egypt and out of Assyria to pester the people of Israel. And the language used here is that Assyria is a tool of God, that God is able to use foreign nations for God's purposes. And so Yahweh is not just the God of Israel, but the concept is developing at this time, not just of a tribal monotheism, but of a monotheism wherein a God has sovereignty over the entire world. And this God can use other nations as well for that God's divine purposes. And so God is saying that God will use Assyria and to shave as if a razor, the head and the hair of the feet and the beard as well, which would have been humiliating. There are cultures today where that is true, where one's beard or one's hair is a sign of dignity, and to shave your beard or to shave your head, you do that as an act of humiliation. Or if you're in battle, the enemy will shave your head. And so the people of Israel are going to be humiliated. And they're going to only be able to keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. And there's more curd eating happening. And this is what the people are going to subsist on. Questions or thoughts here?
What does it mean, razor hired beyond the river?
Yeah, almost like a mercenary.
Yeah.
That God is hiring Assyria for God's purposes. Beyond the river, probably being whether that's very provincial in terms of Jordan River, or Assyria is in the land of the Tigris Euphrates. And so, yeah. Ooh, good question, because we talked about that maybe last week, that that feet are used as a sexual euphemism in the uncovering of Boaz's feet by Ruth. And so to shave even the hair of the feet, I'm not sure. I've never read anything about that, but two things come to mind. One, if it is involved in that, like super humiliating, but also just like it would be as if you were to say, like, I'm going to take everything from you, even the crumbs in the corner of your house. Like, I'm going to shave every hair, even the ones on your toes. Like, this is going to be a depth of humiliation. Yeah, what a funny phrase. Any other thoughts on this one?
Just that verse 18 to me sounds so much like the plagues, right? And are the flies one of them?
Yeah, gnats, flies. So Kevin said verse 18 sounds like the plagues. And as I was reading it just now, that's what came to my mind as well. Great observation. On that day, every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. With bows and arrows, one will go there, for all the land will be briars and thorns. And as for the hills that used to be hoed with a hoe, you will not go there for fear of briars and thorns, but they will become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. This was a tactic at the time. They didn't have nuclear warfare, but they had ecological warfare. And so during battle, you would devastate your enemy by burning their crops and their lands. And so the people are going to experience ecological devastation as a consequence for their activities. And as I think about that, we can think about the ecological devastation that is a consequence of our own actions today, I think, as we think about something like this. But the land will, where there used to be 1,000 vines, there was abundance, and you had abundance, and you are going to lose that abundance, and it's going to be briars and thorns. All right, chapter 8, we have another child. Then the Lord said to me, take a large tablet and write on it in common characters belonging to Maher Shalal Hashbaz, and have it attested for me by reliable witnesses, the priest Uriah and Zechariah, son of Jeberechiah. And I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, name him Maher Shalal Hashbaz, for before the child knows how to call my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away by the king of Assyria. The Lord spoke to me again, because this people has refused the waters of Shiloah that flow gently and melt in fear before Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Therefore, the Lord is bringing up against it the mighty floodwaters of the river, the king of Assyria and all his glory. It will rise above its channels and overflow all its banks. It will sweep on into Judah as a flood, and pouring over will reach up to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Okay. So a tablet, write on it in common characters belonging to Maher Shalal Hashbaz, which means the spoil hastens and the prey quickens. What a name. Basically what is translated later into English for us, the concept of the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away, that this destruction is imminent. And so the name of this child will come to fruition even before it knows how to say dada and mama, that this will happen. And again, we're talking to Ahaz, who's the king of Judah, but the prophecy is about what will happen to the northern kingdom and to Damascus. So it's basically a don't be afraid. This isn't happening to you. It's happening up here. You should have trusted God, but you didn't, is what Isaiah is saying to Ahaz. So he went to the prophetess. So it's an English euphemism to go to or to know. In Genesis, Adam knew Eve, and here he went to the prophetess. So he's going to a woman involved in cultic religious practices and is bearing a son with her and is using the name as part of the prophecy. And by writing on the tablet, it kind of relates to the concept of, yeah, go ahead, Robin.
So he is told to go into, doesn't he have a wife? He has a son.
Yeah.
already. And he's told to go to this woman who's involved in cultic worship.
And perhaps this prophetess is his wife. So that's not delineated for us. But I'm blowing it. Well, it's the same thing with Hosea, who's told to go to the prostitute. But he eventually marries her, yeah.
Is this like Joseph Smith was told to marry a whole bunch of women and, he had the good word from God. And I don't know. This is
Yeah.
shocking me a little bit. I hadn't realized what was going on here.
Yeah. If we want to preserve our moral sensibilities on what's happening, I think we could say that this is his wife. What's going on? Yeah. Well, there's nothing to. Yeah. So I'm sorry for folks online. The question is like, whoa, like why? What's going on with goes into a prophetess? Doesn't he have a wife? Is this something like Joseph Smith being told that he should marry all these women? And this is what God says. Yeah, great question. So there's nothing here that we couldn't come to the conclusion that the prophetess is his wife. It was not uncommon for that sort of relationship to happen, for the male prophetic folks to be in relationship with the female prophetic folks. But at the same time, often these cultic women were, unmarried virgins. So maybe not. And then, so is this what God is saying?
But where do you get, I'm sorry, I'm not raising my hand.
No, you're fine.
But where do you get that she was cultic?
Yeah. Just from historical analysis. So that could be wrong. Maybe she's referred to as, maybe prophetess means Mrs. Prophet. And then it's not so much of a question. But it is a historical reality that there were temples where women participated in, their whole job was just cultic ritual. So that could also be what's going on here. Don't know. This is all just making guesses based on cultural context. I want to look into that one a little more too, to see if there's a historical basis for the word prophetess.
I love
being. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. I want to know if there's any basis in that. And then the question becomes like, what is God up to with this? How much of this is Isaiah? How much of this is God? Which is just a legitimate question that we can't answer fully. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Okay, I'm gonna look more into that one. Any other questions on this passage? Oh yeah, I was about to talk about that. Thank you. The tablet and the common characters, yeah.
It's like the tablet's supposed to belong to something.
Yeah, so it's almost as if it's staking a claim and it's being signed by witnesses. And so that's actually going to be something else that Jeremiah is asked to do. Jeremiah is asked to go buy the deed of land in Israel, even in the midst of declaring that they're going to go into exile, as a way to say God is going to bring people back to this land. And so we're going to buy the deed to this land, even though we're going away, because God is saying you will come back. And that's what comes to mind as I'm thinking of this tablet, that it's just evidence of what Isaiah is saying, that I didn't name this child Mahir Shalal Hashbaz in a moment. This is his birth certificate. He's always been named that. And so here's proof that what God said does come to pass later. And I think the common characters is just in something that's readable. Are there uncommon characters? Are there levels of Hebrew that would have been more difficult? Maybe it's just like, make this really obvious so that people can read it who know how to read. Yeah, so it's almost like a birth certificate, and it's being signed by witnesses.
What I'm trying to figure out is that it seems like there's this interplay between the name and Emmanuel, right? We were told a couple verses ago that the child is going to be called Emmanuel.
Yeah.
And then Emmanuel comes, but Emmanuel comes back at the end of this screen too.
Yeah, and it's functioning in here almost as if it's a place name too, that the land is being called Emmanuel, or the people as a whole are called Emmanuel. It will sweep on into Judah as a flood, and pouring over will reach up to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Is he talking to the child? Is he using this to refer to Judah as being God's promise that God is with this land? That, the people who, there's a judgment here on the kingship, and yet also this concept of, so Ahaz is not referred to as king, but is still referred to as the house of David. And so even though Ahaz will be deposed, the house of David will not end. That the idea of the continual chain until Christ, as we interpret it with Christian eyes, will remain. And so even though there's judgment on the land, these are still God's people. So it's almost as if they're being told, you are a people whose name is God with us. But it is interesting that this name comes up again, and I think we're going to get it again in chapter 9 as well. Yeah, Chris?
I don't have anything substantive to say about this, but I think that extended metaphor of water in that very long last sentence is really extraordinary.
So Chris said that the extended metaphor of water in these last couple of verses is extraordinary. What's extraordinary about it for you?
That it is so extended. Is quite remarkable, and how it contrasts the waters of Shiloh, which flow gently, and then flood waters, which are destructive. Water must have been very, very important in that desert environment.
Oh, absolutely.
Very apt metaphor for Jesus.
Yeah, oh, that's beautiful. So Chris said that seeing how there's this juxtaposition of the calm waters of Shiloh that flow gently, and yet there's also these flood waters, recognizing that in this desert environment, how important water is, which is absolutely right. If you're in the Judean wilderness, and when we hear the word wilderness, often I think of like a forest, but this is just desert hills. And so if you don't have a source of water upon your caravan path, then you're in trouble. Water is so valuable. And you're right. I think it's interesting that water can be life-giving. And when I hear the waters flowing gently, it makes me think of one of the early Psalms, Psalm 1, that a righteous person is like a tree planted by the waters, and the water nourishes the roots of the tree. And so water can be nourishing. And yet what can also be nourishing can also become floodwaters. And so it's a warning that you should be able to find grace in those moments of the waters being gentle, because you don't know when it will become floodwaters. Yeah, that is a really cool metaphor. Anything else here? check the time. All right. Take notice, you peoples, and be dismayed. Listen, all you far countries, gird yourselves and be dismayed. Take counsel together, but it shall be brought to naught. Speak a word, but it will not stand, for God is with us. The Lord spoke thus to me while his hand was strong upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what it fears or be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall regard as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. He will become a sanctuary, a stone one strikes against. For both houses of Israel, he will become a rock one stumbles over, a trap and a snare for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble. They shall fall and be broken. They shall be snared and taken. So it sounds as if Isaiah is getting a pep talk here, where he's delivering this word and the people are referring to it as conspiracy. And Isaiah is told, they think it's a conspiracy. They don't think it's true, but the word I tell you is true. And all of the planning and plotting they're doing is for naught. And this language of snare and trap is language that's used by Paul later, where he says that Jesus is a stumbling block for those who don't believe, that if you're presented with knowledge of God and yet choose to reject that knowledge, then that knowledge serves as something that causes you to stumble, because how can you reject this? And so as a result of rejecting it, you fall and are broken and are snared. Okay, it's kind of a strange interlude here. Any thoughts here? All right. Bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. See, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion. Now, if people say to you, consult the ghosts and the familiar spirits that chirp and mutter, should not a people consult their gods, the dead, on behalf of the living, for teaching and for destruction? Surely those who speak like this will have no dawn. They will pass through the land, greatly distressed and hungry. When they are hungry, they will be enraged and will curse their king and their gods. They will turn their faces upward, or they will look to the earth, but they will see only distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. Two things here. We have a reference to the disciples of Isaiah, and that they are tasked with the role of binding up the testimony or writing it down, putting it onto scrolls, maybe putting those scrolls into clay pots for preservation. And so we talked about how historically we kind of have first, second, and third Isaiah, that there are different parts of this book written at different times. And so the historical figure Isaiah is going to die, and yet his work or his name will carry on by people who come after him, who are carrying on the tradition of Isaiah. He had disciples who are carrying on his message or his prophetic work. Verse 19 just kind of seems like another warning against relying on anything other than God. So you're relying on foreign nations to come into alliance with you, but those alliances aren't going to protect you. Or you're consulting other spiritual beings. And so verses like this have led to like a big disdain for Christian mysticism in some circles, or the concept of anything that reeks of potentially the occult. But then there's going to be large swaths of Christians at later times who will be devout mystics. And so hard to know exactly what to do with this, but here it's obviously like, don't consult anything other than God. If you think there are other spiritual beings out there, they're not going to give you an answer, only God will. Questions or thoughts here? Let's keep moving. All right, let's jump into chapter 9. But there will be no gloom for those who were in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, But in the latter time, he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Maybe your ears are going to perk up with verse 2. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. You have multiplied exultation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as people exult when dividing plunder. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. All right, let's get into this quick. For all the boots of the trampling warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Great will be his authority, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. All right, you've heard some of that language before, right? This is our Advent text, that Jesus is the light that shines in deep darkness, and Jesus is the one who shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of his authority there shall be no end. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Moses's father-in-law is Jethro the Midianite. So it's just a desert people, in the land of Canaan. And so they are part of just kind of that general reference to Canaanites. And so there's a lot of words that are kind of used in place of another. Midian's just a reference to that group of people there. Yeah.
What is the Lord of hosts?
Yeah, it's a military term. And so hosts being both heavenly hosts, if there's like a heavenly entourage of heavenly beings, but also hosts can just be your army, that you are the Lord of the hosts of these people. So the concept of angels and angelology won't be really fleshed out until what's called the intertestamental period. So after the last book of the Old Testament's written and before the New Testament is written, that's the intertestamental period. That's a time in Jewish religion where there's a lot of talk about angels, but there is a concept that there's a lot of threads of ancient Near Eastern religion that are woven into our scriptures. So when it talks about God coming on the clouds and having thunderbolts, that we don't have Zeus yet, we don't have Greek mythology yet, but what we do have is Baal, and that's the language used of Baal. Baal is a storm god. And so that is uncomfortable for a lot of people when they learn that, like, oh my gosh, why are we using cultic imagery to describe God of other gods? But it was a practice to kind of co-opt the language of other gods. That, okay, you think your God's the storm god, but I'm going to use that language to speak about my God. My God's the storm god. And so that's what people are doing in the ancient Near East, is taking language from other cultures and using it to describe their God. And Baal was also kind of this military warrior as well. And so they're taking that and saying, no, our God's the military warrior. And another concept that's drawn from the ancient Near East is this idea that there is a heavenly assembly, that up in the heavens where God resides, it's not just the one God, but there's this whole cohort of gods. And so that concept is used in the book of Job, which is one of our most ancient texts in the Old Testament, where Hasatan, the accuser, goes up to talk with God, because there's this whole group of gods just kind of talking with each other. So that is not what we have developed as Christians in terms of our understanding of God, but that is a concept at play in the ancient Near East, that there is a host of heavenly beings. So it's not quite what we would describe as angels per se, but just other creatures. Like we already saw in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah is called, there's the seraphim. So there are those angels or those heavenly creatures. So what I mean by not angels we think of today, it's not like a guardian angel per se. but just like heavenly creatures. Does that make sense? There was a lot of info that I just threw out. I don't know why I talked about all that different stuff. It's all interesting. So let me just say, to kind of bring it home on that question, where do we see that Lord of Hosts? The zeal of the Lord of Hosts will do this. The basic meaning of it is God is a God of everything in heaven and on earth. Whether that's heavenly beings or the people of the earth and their military endeavors, God's God over everything. That's the basic meaning of Lord of Hosts. Okay, I think we should pick up with this passage again next week and delve even deeper because it is a central Christian text. Everyone okay with that? Any last burning things you want to say? Okay. So I said 2 weeks ago that we had kind of a clear calendar. We don't. We've got other things that keep popping up. So Isaiah in 2 weeks. So we'll take this up in 2 weeks. A church member named Michelle Dowd is becoming really popular, latent popularity here that's just going to continue to bubble up. She wrote a memoir of being raised by her grandfather who started a religious cult here in California. And so she wrote about that. It's going to have a write-up in Time Magazine later this month or next month. And so she's going to be talking about her book called Forager and about this memoir of how she what she learned about religion from that experience and how she came out of it and found spiritual freedom in developing her own faith. So she's going to talk about that book next week at 9 a.m. Should be really interesting. And then we'll pick up with this chapter in 2 weeks. All right, awesome. Thanks, everybody. See you in worship.